Hey guys, Loman02. I kind of want to do a post-mortem on the big blue or the blue-white Azorius Miracles deck that I recently did a rather lengthy deck tech and some gameplay on. I'm going to include more gameplay in this one, but before we jump into that, I kind of wanted to go over one change that I made to the deck after we kind of did our deck tech plus some hasty building involving adding Cast Out and Settle the Wreckage. As well as Hieroglyphic Illumination to the build. I've also added Glacial Fortress because right now I'm not in a back-to-basics configuration. I thought it just made sense. Now, I'm not a huge Edakar Waste fan. Edakar Waste, if you're not familiar, says taps for a colorless widget and/or taps to add blue or white, but you lose one life from doing that. Alright, where's the card reader at? Not this. Display card reader. So I am running a Glacial Palace now, or Glacial Fortress, I'm sorry. This card right here, evidently an M13 variant. It's just a blue-white duel. It's neither a plains nor an island, so its value is down a little bit with the fetch lands, but, it's still just a good duel. I'm not running Nimbus Maze of note. The reason I'm not running Nimbus Maze, a lot of folks are high on Nimbus Maze, it's a fine card, but one, I mean, it is a cost to have more duels in your deck. It can be a cost. It can also help fix, but the problem with Nimbus Maze I've found is unless you have a dual land initially, it's not a good second land to play. And generally speaking, it's going to be a good third land to play. So if you only open on like a 2-land hand that has a lot of cantrips, because you'll keep 2-landers with a bunch of cantrips in this deck, because you can generally use your cantrips to find lands. And it always assures that you're going to have gas if you keep a hand like that. Or it ensures that you'll have gas for longer if you keep a hand like that, or at least answers. I don't know if you call them gas, but answers to gas, your opponent's gas. But anyways, Nimbus Maze, to me, is just a little too awkward. Another one I'm not running is Temple of Epiphany, I want to say. The blue-white temple. I'm not running that either. I don't really care if it comes to play tap lands, and I'm running very few in the deck. I'm running, Celestial Colonnade, which comes to play tap land, but I think I just have to, because you do want to have a few ways to pressure Planeswalkers if you cannot readily answer them with the deck. I mean, it does have answers to Planeswalkers in the form of Detention Sphere, Cast Out, Council's Judgment. It can bounce them with Cryptic Command and then get them on the backswing. It can tuck them with Teferi. It can Fractured Identity them. It's got quite a few answers to Planeswalkers. It also has Gideon to threaten them and, Elspeth. But if you already have one of those on the board, you're generally doing all right. But it's kind of just a card that I want to leave in there. And then also Myriad Landscape as it comes to play tap land. It's a very slow 2-for-1, but the card is very powerful, and if you could open on this, I think it tends to be pretty good. Otherwise, all my other lands come into play untapped. One other thing I want to mention, I kind of want to talk through like a term that I use pretty often. It's called sunk cost. But I don't think I've really ever explained it. So, sunk cost. Right now we're running Dig Through Time. One of the points that I think is flexible is Dig Through Time in this list, and I think it's flexible with this card, Enlightened Tutor, right here, which is a card that, if the deck could play freely, it probably would. It may not accrue all of this sunk cost, but because you're on a pointed scale, I don't think Ancestral generally wants to come out of this deck. If it does, you probably bring in a Demonic Tutor package, would be my guess. And then you get a lot more 1-point slots for stuff like Library of Alexandria, Treasure Cruise, Enlightened Tutor, etc. But I think the least replaceable effect in this deck is actually Ancestral Recall. One of the games we'll play here momentarily. A lot shorter today, I promise. You kind of see why I think that. I just think Ancestral Recall is kind of what allows a deck that has this many 1-for-1 answers to and 1-for-1 card selection to get back ahead, to basically stop the expansion of the opposition and then just charge ahead with vast card advantage after stopping the initial onslaught. But anyways, Enlightened Tutor is kind of one of the replacement cards for Dig Through Time. Obviously, negative card advantage, but what you trade in card advantage that you would gain over something like Dig Through Time is a perfect selection. Dig Through Time gives you some selection because you're looking at a lot of cards. 7 cards, getting 2 of those top 7 cards is very powerful, but Enlightened Tutor finds you exactly what you want. That's it. It's a little more fragile to effects like Aven Mind Sensor, but once you put Enlightened Tutor in your deck, and the reason you do that is generally speaking for like greedy metas where everyone's running very, I don't want to say precarious, but very, very dual-laden mana bases, greedy mana bases, whatever you want to call it. Back to Basics just houses some decks, and if you're able to get this down against the right deck, you can generally just lock them out of the game. That said, when you bring in Enlightened Tutor, I think you're incentivized to bring in some other tech. I actually don't mind Rune of Protection Red, because this deck does have a very challenging matchup against red decks. This card also cycles, and the fact that you can find it with Enlightened Tutor makes it pretty powerful. Right now I'm running much more universal tech, which I kind of talked through in the last video, which is Timely Reinforcements. I don't like replacing Timely Reinforcements for a far more narrow hate card, like Rune R. But, I think there is consideration to it once you start actually playing Enlightened Tutor. There's a stronger consideration. Additionally, I think that, the moat becomes a much stronger consideration as well. The reason being, once you have Enlightened Tutor in your deck, moat is a powerful effect. Like, it doesn't stop everything, but it's kind of a wrath that keeps on giving. So if you're playing against, like, green-black aggro or red-green aggro, the moat can just be a hard lock. I mean, they have answers to it, don't get me wrong. I mean, they have stuff like Assassin's Trophy, they have Reclamation Sage, But, if you get untapped with moat in play against, red-green or green-white, or any variety of decks that are generally just ground-pounding decks, they're going to have a very tough time beating it. Additionally, Counterbalance. Counterbalance is another card that I think becomes a lot more interesting once you include Enlightened Tutor. We're already a Sensei's Dividing Top deck, and you could use Enlightened Tutor to find Sensei's Dividing Top, but the ability to find, we are a top deck, but the ability to find Counterbalance with Enlightened Tutor very specifically, I think increases the value of Counterbalance a lot. I don't think I'd run Counterbalance just in my deck, just randomly, because the card is very specific. Like, it's kind of tough to get going, right? I mean, there's a lot of effects that allow us to manipulate the top of our deck so that we could actually benefit from this, but I think the inability to find it regularly makes it kind of an awkward draw in a lot of phases of the game. Trinket Mage. So once you start playing Enlightened Tutor, and I get it, like Enlightened Tutor doesn't find Trinket Mage, but the reason that Trinket Mage's value goes up in the deck, and it's another additional sunk cost of playing a card like Enlightened Tutor, is that Trinket Mage finds Sensei's Dividing Top, right? And the fact that it finds Sensei's Dividing Top means that the value of Counterbalance goes up, and this is kind of like the avalanche of sunk cost is kind of how I look at it. Like, once you decide to change out one pointed card for another, you want to increase the value of your points as much as possible. That's kind of like my build philosophy in this format, and I'm new to the format, so I'm kind of learning. But I think as much as possible, you want to exploit the power of your pointed cards. The pointed cards are in general pointed for a reason, maybe excepting the ones that just came off, like Personal Tutor, which is pretty fair. But it's great in this deck. But if you're going to play a card like Enlightened Tutor, like, I think you accrue a lot of sunk cost, and I think that ends up ranging a little bit further than generally you think. And I don't think I've assessed all of the sunk cost of playing a card like Enlightened Tutor, but I do think Trinket Mage's value goes up once you have Enlightened Tutor, or it increases the equity of Enlightened Tutor, because it allows you to actually get this combo going with Counterbalance and Sensei's Dividing Top right here. Back to Basics, I think, is generally going to be an include because the card is powerful in this deck. This deck is mostly filled with basics. We are running, I believe, 19 or 20 right now. I may have cut one basic planes down to 19 basics for the Glacial Fortress. Back to Basics is very powerful. Additionally, Engineered Explosives. Once you're able to find this, so if you're going to include Trinket Mage because you want to find top is the general course of action because of having a card like Enlightened Tutor in your deck, then why wouldn't you also want Engineered Explosives? Because if I already have the top, or I don't need top, or I'm going to die to the board, then Trinket Mage can find Engineered Explosives and blow up a bunch of 1-drops, 2-drops, or 3-drops. And if I'm going to play Engineered Explosives, why would I want to run Academy Runes, right? Because then I can start recursing, some of these effects, or I can recurse Engineered Explosives and continue to blow things up. Now, I don't think Academy Runes goes in over a base or any of the lands that we currently have. I think it probably goes in as a 40th land. But this is kind of what I mean by sunk cost. I think once you kind of go down the rabbit hole of putting a different pointed card in your deck, you really have to assess how you build synergies to most build equity in that card. The pointed cards are pointed for a reason. That's kind of, that's honestly, that ties back to one of the assessments I've shared in the Discord channel, is I think Ancestral Recall is probably the most busted card in the format. Now, I think Black Lotus is a better card, don't get me wrong, but Black Lotus, the reason I think Ancestral Recall is a more busted card than Black Lotus is because Ancestral Recall doesn't really require sunk cost. Ancestral Recall just gives you more options. Black Lotus tends to be a build-around card, so I think in general, if you opt to run Black Lotus outside of like Red Deck Wins, generally speaking, you're playing combo, and combo in general accrues a lot of sunk cost. And what I mean by that is if you're going to play a card like Tendrils of Agony, then your deck has to be built around being able to play Tendrils of Agony, which means you have less options as a builder in general. I mean, you have options, don't get me wrong, but your options are not infinite. With Ancestral Recall, basically, if you have islands and you can cast this 1-mana spell, then you can draw more cards that ideally are good and do what you want them to do. Or they're lands and they allow you to build up on resources. Either way, it builds resources, it builds options. And one of the things you'll find in one of the games, and it kind of ties back into this building principle, is that options and greater range of probabilities or possibilities for any given hand or any given outcome of a game are going to benefit you even over denial. So that's why I think that in general, card draw is more powerful than card denial. Not only is card denial or hand attack. Hand attack is very powerful in the right matchups. Just like for instance, a card like Praetor's Grasp. Praetor's Grasp can be very powerful in a certain matchup because certain decks rely on very specific cards to win, and they're not just chock full of good cards like 4-color blood, where all their cards just kill you; they just beat you down. So those effects are very powerful in specific matchups, but card draw is very powerful in general. It just generally gives you more options, right? But we'll kind of showcase some of that in one of the games that I had. All right, Seat of the Synod. I think if you're going to play Trinket Mage, you want to be able to find a base. You want to be able to find a land, not a basic land, but a land with it. That sometimes comes into play. And honestly, when I was playing Enlightened Tutor and German Highlander, I generally tended to run this and the white land. Eventually, I think I cut the white land and just played this. So that with Enlightened Tutor, I had the ability to top tutor a land. If my hand kind of became awkward, or if I got wastelanded or strip bind or something like that, I could, not strip bind, but wastelanded, I could find a basic land that produced blue mana. Academy Runes again. So it's funny, like when you kind of go into including a card like Enlightened Tutor, I think, the cards that, directly build equity in it also have cards that build equity in them. And it's kind of like it's an avalanche of sunk cost. So if we were to play all of these cards over a card so if we were to choose to play Enlightened Tutor over Dig Through Time, maybe not this. This is kind of more optional, but most of these cards, I think, increase the equity of Enlightened Tutor, and we'd have to look to significantly change the deck to kind of rebuild the core of it around better supporting the options that Enlightened Tutor could give us, because we're committing a point to it. That's all I'll say on that, guys. I kind of want to jump into that terminology. When I say sunk cost, it's kind of what, in my mind, that's what sunk cost means. It's basically I've made this choice now. What other choices are not forced, but are a little more, not deterministic either, a little more directed, because I've made this choice. And that's kind of what I mean when I talk about, sunk cost it applies to deck building. So I've added another card into this pile as well, into this pile, my sideboard, my maybe board, my building board is what I want to call it. It's not a sideboard, I don't use it when I play games, but it is my building board. I actually kind of want to play Ash Barons in this deck. The reason I want to play Ash Barons is I really want to build as much equity as I can in the I'm gonna say it, guys, but the Xerox engine, the selection engine. Let's call it the selection engine of the deck. Basically, the mutability of cards to find the range of answers and or problems that I want to have in the game state. The reason Ash Barons I think has some equity in this list is one, it finds a basic land, which is essentially it's a fetch land, in a way, except you don't take damage off it, and it costs you a mana. But its value goes up a lot when you have cards like Sensei's Divining Top, when you have effects like Brainstorm, when you have effects like Jace the Mind Sculptor. And, at the end of the day, I think having the ability to shuffle, especially on this many lands, and 39 lands, is very powerful because you don't want to flood late game. You don't mind having a lot of lands in the early game, but you do not want to flood late game, because that's how you tend to lose games. And we'll actually see a game where I do lose to a little bit of flood, like a very minor amount of flood in the late game, and it kind of ends up costing me. Also, Field of Ruin. I think both these cards, Ash Barons and Field of Ruin, should be in the deck. I need to, again, go back to the mana base and kind of look at it. Field of Ruin, twofold. One, this deck doesn't generally, but sometimes cares about, accruing tempo through mana-based disruption, but generally speaking, it's using its land destruction, which is right now just Wasteland, to deal with utility lands or very powerful lands like Gaia's Cradle or Tolarian Academy that provide vast mana advantage. The same could be said for Field of Ruin. That's what it's going to be intended to do, is kind of just, take care of utility lands or lands that provide many for one mana options to the player, to the pilot of that deck. Field of Ruin is also a shuffle effect, which is kind of interesting because, again, we can kind of go back into using these effects, like using the colorless cards as effects that better support, our selection engine in the deck. And I think the more equity you can build in selection in a deck like this, the stronger the deck's going to become. And I got to play, I think, 4 or 5 more games, and I'll try to showcase all of them in the gameplay that's going to be coming up here relatively soon with this list, post the changes that we made, because the gameplay that I had up before was all with the more dated list that was running the Moat and Wrath of God in it, and probably a few different things. But, I got to play a lot of more games, and the deck feels really strong. Very, very strong deck. Still not a match-neutral deck, but I think it allows you to play a very good game of Magic. and I think it's getting pretty close to where I want it to be. So I'm going to go on a quick pause, guys, and then we'll jump into some gameplay, so, hopefully we get a little more action and not me just talking about, deck building theory, or my take on deck building. None of this is new stuff. It's just kind of how I go about, tuning and refining these lists. And again, I'm pretty serious about blue-white. I love this deck. I think it's one of the most fun to play. Because, and some folks would strongly disagree with that, because I can definitely agree it's probably not the most fun to play against, because it tends to feel like it's just always, if it works, it tends to feel like the other person's not playing Magic, but that also means that you're making good decisions to actually get into a position to be able to do that to them. Anyways, I'm going to go to a quick pause, and we'll jump into the gameplay here relatively soon, guys. Be back. Alrighty, guys, back. So this first game is going to be against Hoof deck. I don't know that going in. This hand's perfectly fine. And it's funny, I was having a dialogue with someone in regards to running Sunken Hollow and Underground Sea for essentially what amounts to 2 cards in the deck that actually care about black mana, Nihil Spellbomb and Mystical Teachings. And this is the perfect hand to kind of showcase why I think that's an important consideration, or to have both black sources in the deck. This is not a hand I'm going to throw back, but it's also not a hand where I can really afford to not play my Underground Sea into a possible Wasteland. So if I get Wastelanded, my Underground Sea gets Wastelanded, I don't have the ability to recurse lands, so that's why you want the secondary black source, I think, in the deck, even though we don't have any literal black cards in the deck. Opponent plays Brushland, doesn't really tell me much. They could be mid-range, could be anything. I just go ahead and suspend Ancestral Vision. I know that forces me to lose some equity on both Spell Snare and Force Spike, which kind of stinks, but I think I'm going to want to have those options by turn 4. They play on a Sylvan Caryatid, but luckily they don't have an additional land, and they don't take damage off of their Sylvan library. Oddly enough, I actually opt to Condescend here because I kind of want to, try to clear up my top deck. I'm actually looking for mana here. I think I need at least one more land drop, and then I probably need to find a win condition at some point in time. But those lands are not completely unwelcome. But I'm kind of relying basically on holding on until Ancestral Vision comes off. They cast out a Tireless Tracker. We get fortunate, and I'm not going to say it's a greedier line. It's generally what you're going to do. They held the land, so they get value off the Tireless Tracker, but we just go ahead and Force Spike it, which is kind of nice to get equity in our Force Spike on turn 4. I believe they finally start drawing with the library here, which is good. I think in general you want to just draw very heavily with this deck. So they Sylvan Library, or Sylvan Scrying here, I'm sorry. And we rapidly Spell Snare that. That's probably going to get, either a Wasteland or it's going to get Gaia's Cradle. One or the other. But we're just biding time, so we get Ancestral Vision off. Now, we found Personal Tutor, which is going to be capable of either getting us Terminus or getting us an Entreat the Angels. I don't have to go for it here. One, I don't have white mana. I could have played another white mana out, but I'd kind of rather just get enough angels in one go that I just win in one hit. So I do go ahead and Visions here. I believe bottom both. I do go ahead and Path to Exile that. I probably should have done that on their upkeep. Yeah, I'm trying to think of why I didn't. Yeah, no, there's really no reason why. It was just bad. That was poor play on my part. So they go ahead and Eldritch Evolution here. I mean, I have everything covered for the most part. I go ahead and dissolve this, see a mana leak. I believe bottom the mana leak, but I can't quite recall. No, I keep it. I keep it because their deck's going to be casting bigger bombs. I do go ahead and PT here, looking for Settle the Wreckage. I'm sorry, not Settle the Wreckage. Entreat the Angels. They go down to 7. Fetch. I believe attempt to cast a Terastodon, and we get to mana leak it. They're going to have a lot of big mana spells. So Mana Leak is actually going to make Mana Leak and Force Spike actually scale pretty well in this matchup, oddly enough. Now, oftentimes you don't have the time to be waiting around just trying to do that if they get a fast early start. We just go ahead and cast Entreat for a little bit of mana. I actually leave up Snapcaster plus Force Spike here. Because they're already at 6, I don't need more angels than that, so it makes more sense to make them play around stuff. And oddly enough, my play ends up making sense. It's odd that you would think Snapcaster. So Force Spike was useful in 2 parts of the game, in the earlier to mid game, and then here in the end game when we're trying to win. We get to Force Spike a Green Sun Zenith for 6, which I don't know what that's getting specifically. Probably Primeval Titan, but I don't know that. I could just be getting a Thragtusk to go to 10 and stay alive. That's possible. I don't think there's much they can get, but I just go ahead and force. I prepare to force spike it regardless. This is the Hoof matchup. I actually think this version of Blue White's actually decently favored against Hoof because it's actually decently set up. It's decently well set up to react pretty well along a curve. Now it actually has less Wraths. I actually think Wraths are counterintuitive against Hoof. I think if the player of the Hoof deck's pretty good, they're going to generally tend to figure out what you're up to and play around them in a way that, like, yes, they're going to get had to a certain extent by them, but then they'll just re-expand after you played it, so it's really the second Wrath that kills them. This deck can Wrath and instant speed in two ways, so Settle the Wreckage and Terminus, right? Terminus being the more powerful option, because obviously you don't want to ramp the ramp deck. Their ramp is more necessary to be in creature form because they want to kill you with it, but I think in general you don't tend to want to do that, but, either way, I mean, getting the creatures off the board is still very relevant. That said, kind of an interesting matchup. I think in general, it's a lot closer than it looks here. I mean, we're just kind of beating up on them because of how the draws played out. I do think one thing they possibly could have done differently is utilize the Sylvan Library aggressively. One thing you'll see some folks do is not aggressively use Sylvan Library if the cards on the top of their deck are not that good. But I think the way you have to look at it is that, if you don't have a way to shuffle readily available, it's better just to take the bad cards off the top of your deck so you can find more good ones on the following turn. And life total does not matter at all against I tend to treat life total as just a drawing resource when I have a Sylvan Library out against islands. I just don't respect islands to be able to do damage to me incrementally. I figure that if islands are going to beat me, they're going to kill me all at once. They're not going to, kill me incrementally and slowly with like bolts and stuff. So, but some of that comes down to them possibly not only the matchup either. I led off on blue. I didn't lead off on another color, so they could have figured I was possibly on Blood Moon as well, which maybe they played a little more cautiously around because Blood Moon decks tend to run bolts and burn. So anyways, this was game one in this match. I will go on a momentary pause, guys, and we'll be back shortly. Personal tutor, you get to see you do some work there. That's what it's intended to do, is to set up either the win con or Terminus, and I love it in this deck. I think it's good. Anyways, be back momentarily, guys. Alrighty, guys, we are back. Again, a very keepable hand. Now, the one downside of this hand is it does not have white mana. It does not have a Wrath. But the cool thing with this hand is my opponent's on the play, and I have a Spell Snare. Spell Snare on the draw tends to be pretty good. It also has a Wasteland to get like any man land or, like a Gaia's Cradle. This hand can basically buy a lot of time. One thing this hand can't do is react to the board. This deck relies on white mana to react to the board. So that is one frailty of this hand. Opponent plays Forest and a Boreal Druid. We draw into a Plains because we're luck misers. We're very lucky. They play on a 2-drop here. I go ahead and Spell Snare it. Yep. Draw to a counter spell. Cool. I believe opponent just drops a Garruk. I go ahead and just Mana Leak this. I probably should have negated it. I just tend to think that, in general... Now, I Wasteland here. I'm doing it, honestly, just to bide time. I don't have action in hand, so I'm looking to bide time. Force Spike's not going to be, in general, that great in this matchup. I draw to my other white source, which is kind of cool. I do Force Spike the Reclamation Sage, because I just don't want them to have action. They go ahead and activate the Treetop Village. Now, I do kind of look like an idiot for blowing up their Canopy Vista, because now they have a manland that I have to be able to deal with. I get fairly fortunate and draw into an Ancestral Recall here, though. They cast out a Nissa, negate it. I don't think negate has a shortage of targets in this list, so it's not per se true. I Mise into a Terminus as the first card off the Ancestral I cast on their turn. I do use it as a Swords to Plowshares, essentially, to kill their one creature on the board. They can attack me with the Treetop Village here, and they do. They're not going to try to cast into 5 open mana, which I think is smart play. I do go ahead and Impulse here, find a Swords to Plowshares, which is what I was looking for. I was going to look for that, or a Path to Exile. I get to blow up their land. I cycle a Miscalculation, find Council's Judgment, find another land. I have 2 counters and an answer to anything that may resolve, like a Thrun or something like that. They play out a Knight of the Reliquary. I go ahead and use the least efficient counter spell that also allows me to scry. I believe I get rid of Supreme Verdict, oddly enough, in this position. And I find Mission Briefing. Yes, I do get rid of it. I'm going to use Mission Briefing here to get back Ancestral Recall. I do not cast it on my turn because I don't want to be down to 1 blue mana and off of counter magic at that point. When they do nothing on their turn, I believe I keep Settle, and I put the land on the bottom. I do kind of want to have 1 Wrath. I have enough cards in hand now, enough answers in hand that I want to have 1 Wrath. I find Elspeth as well. Elspeth is just going to split this game wide open. Opponent plays a Whisperwood Elemental. You can also get to, again, see how lucky I am here. I draw into Entreat the Angels, because why not, I guess when it rains, it pours. So we end up casting this thing for all the mana. I mean, I could have left up it could have made sense to leave up Counterspell to try to get like a natural order or something like that. But I think even if my opponent natural orders, sacking the Whisperwood Elemental, sacking the Whisperwood Elemental to find Craterhoof Behemoth, I don't think it's enough damage. I have enough toughness on board to block it out, which is the worst case. I mean, if we already know I guess Eldritch Evolution could go to 7. I don't think there's a 7-drop Hoof. I could be wrong. Hoof's an 8er. The Forerunners and the Eldrazi Pig. I'm trying to think. I think they're both 8ers as well. Anyways, I don't think there's any cards that really get them out of it. Even if they have like a good card like Natural Order or like Birthing Pod or something like that, which I don't think Birthing Pod tends to be a card they run. I don't think there's any independent creature that gets them out of this. And my thinking was, tap out for it because you have Council's Judgment to blow up anything that's really relevant, like a Dromoka or something like that. Dromoka could be a thing they got if they had Natural Order on Whisperwood. I don't know if that even races this. It's going to be tough. It's going to be tough to raise this. It could possibly raise this board position. But the problem is eventually, if they're going to have to attack with the Dromoka as well, I think, because they can't just sit around forever and let Elspeth just tick up. I don't know how they win, actually. I don't know. We had a very sound draw. I mean, we kind of luck-sacked into a Terminus off the Ancestral. We ended up mising into 2 win cons very rapidly, in very rapid succession, in perfect timing. So we got very lucky on this draw. I do think we played well. I think we played well in this game. The first game, I think there was more debate as to how we played. There was definitely more lines where we could have left up earlier interaction for their development as opposed to casting out Ancestral Vision. I don't think they would have been correct. I think you want to get Vision online, especially in the dark. We didn't know, what we were playing. We saw Grasslands. But anyways, very interesting games against Samsoni 1 here. Definitely enjoyed them, man. And kind of got to showcase this matchup. This is Green-White Hoof versus, I call it Blue-White Splash Black Miracles. And I think Blue-White Miracles, has a pretty strong game plan against them. I think in general people would think that, but I think it's closer than you'd think. But I think this version of Blue-White is pretty strong against creature-based strategies. And it's funny because we actually, oddly enough, run less Wraths than most of their decks, but we have more ways of getting after our Wraths, to include Personal Tutor, Personal Tutor, Mystical Tutor, Mystical Teachings for either. And then we have the 3 Wraths. We have Settle, we have Supreme Verdict, and then we have Terminus. So basically, we have up to I consider it generally being 6 Wraths. I have the ability to play as a 6 Wrath deck, but I'm actually only a 3 Wrath deck with 3 cards that have additional modality, and 2 of which are to just win with Entreat the Angels, because it's very rare that you'll cast Entreat the Angels for a sizable enough number and you won't just win the game off of it, because it's just a lot of tokens. Now, sometimes they just randomly have Maelstrom Pulse and you don't win, but oftentimes, it's pretty good for you once that's happened. Anyways, guys, quick pause. We'll be back for the next match in these games that I'm going to showcase with Blue-White post changes in my last deck tech and gameplay. Alright, guys, we are back. This is a perfect opener. It's got a Muddle, which is fine in control mirrors. It also just transmutes into something good like a Snapcaster Mage or a Search for Iskanta. Got an Absorb to bide some time in the early to mid game, and Condescend is kind of like a good 2-mana counter. I like it, especially being on the play. Condescend's value goes up a lot because you should be ahead on mana progression unless you're playing against like one of the more rampy decks or like an artifact laden deck. Opponent plays on a Mana Crypt. I lament the fact that they had the mana crypt and they didn't play it before the land. If they had, I guess I know actually it wouldn't have mattered here. We would have been able to condescend it. Spell Pierce, your turn too late, buddy, because I definitely would have Spell Pierced the heck out of the crypt. So they have a lot of early mana, but they don't have a lot of anything big afterwards. Right now, it looks like. I'm not sure what they're up to. Uh-oh, guys. Game is bugged. Let me go ahead and pause it. I'll be back momentarily. They cast something here, and I believe I counter something there. So, quick pause. We'll be back momentarily. I'm probably going to have to restart Moto so the replay works. Alright, guys, unfortunately that replay is bugged for some reason or another. So we're going to go to game number 2 against Bernie Bell. Bernie Bell's playing I believe 3 or 4 color all Planeswalker deck. She's running a bunch of mana ramp and just a ton of walkers to accrue value. This hand I think is fine against the all walkers deck unless they have early ramp because, it's slow hand, but it has a bunch of counter magic and permission, and it's got a good answer to the board if I can find another white source. And we also can pretty safely assume that before 4 mana they don't have a ton of relevant cards. If they get to 4 mana earlier before we do, then it's a problem. But, in general, even on the draw, we now have Counterspell, we now have a Disallow. This hand's looking great against the Planeswalker deck. They cast out a Dimir Signet. Definitely not going to counter that. Yeah, it looks like they're going to miss a land drop, but I think trying to get after Dimir Signet's kind of not that good. We go ahead and look at the top cards. Top cards are great. Bleed put Censor on top, try to get a 4-drop on the next turn. And then we had, I think, 2 other counter spells, like a Cryptic Command and some other counter magic. They cast a Gideon here. I just go ahead and censor this. When you get to get 4 spike value, it's always really good. Kind of feels like you got away with something. And the fact that Censor cycles is pretty powerful. That's another effect that kind of like, augments the Xerox engine of the deck. I just go ahead and dissolve this, see Brainstorm, which I actually knew about, and I believe I keep that. Because I'm probably going to use it to try to find a land, possibly. No, I get rid of it. I did get rid of it. That's interesting. I got rid of it. I was probably actually looking for a land, and I didn't want to have to Brainstorm. Yeah, that was actually probably it. I kind of wanted to have a land there. I kind of want to make my next land drop. I'm going to cast Mystic Confluence here, regardless, and likely find my next land drop. So I'll draw 2 cards off it. And I do. I find a bazillion land. I just go ahead and play my tapped land out here. I could have played Soldevi Excavations, but it's pretty likely that I'd like to have double counter magic up on this turn. They cast out a Rector. Since I drew into the Swords to Plowshares, I just go ahead and plow the Rector as opposed to countering it. I don't really want to leave that on board. They cast a Teferi. I go ahead and Cryptic Command the Teferi. This is kind of one of the weaknesses of the Planeswalker deck. Well, the Planeswalker deck has 2 weaknesses. I definitely get rid of the Spell Snare. The first weakness is it cannot really be combo very effectively because the cost of interaction just plays a ton of value walkers, or just a ton of walkers that are just of tons of value. Now, I think it also has a tough time against counter magic. Like, counter magic just, I think, tends to beat it because if you look at the mana cost of the converted mana cost of the cards my opponent's playing, vice the converted mana cost of my counter spells, I am capable of taking more actions per turn cycle, which tends to be to their detriment. I try to cast a Sorin Grim Nemesis here. I just go ahead and I believe Factor Fiction here to figure out what my options are. I see an Elspeth Sun's Champion, which I'll take. I also want to have more lands. I go ahead and Mana Leak this gentleman right here. And now, on the next turn, I'm going to be able to cast an Elspeth Sun's Champion and leave up a counter spell. And I also have Cast Out and Council's Judgment to deal with anything that I may need. Not to mention, continuing Avalanche to Avalanche Advantage, we find Mystical Teachings, which, can be a Mystical Tutor to find angels, or it can be an Ancestral Recall, or Dig Through Time. We're going to go ahead and counter the Vraska, because I don't want to have my Elspeth get blown up by it. I believe she blows up any permanents, right? Oh, it does not blow up Planeswalkers. Artifact, Creature, or Enchantment. But I don't want to be putting two 2/2s on board. I just go ahead and cast Angels here. Did I just draw into that randomly again, too? Alright, my draw was very lucky there. Not that I really needed it. I think you only need one good win con. I don't think you need both of these, but you get to see a couple games where we have Elspeth, Sun's Champion, plus Entreat the Angels right in a row. Which oftentimes the deck's not going to run that way, and normally you have to do a little more setup than that. But anyways, just getting enough of their walkers is able to get there. I didn't end up counting the Teferi because there's a chance that I end up just casting it out. And I don't think it's relevant. Like, unless the card they play this turn impacts the board, i.e. Toxic Deluge, there was no point in countering it. Especially coupled with the fact that we have an onboard kill right now, and Teferi is not going to stop me from winning the game by himself. So basically, I told him, hey, force them to show me the next card they had that was capable of dealing with the board situation. It indeed was, so we just disallow it and end up getting the win against the All Planeswalker, I think 4 or 5 color control deck. The deck was pretty sweet. I like Bernie Bell's deck idea. That's just one of the things that I think the Planeswalker decks tend to fall short on, like the All Planeswalker decks tend to fall short on, is that they just don't have a good solid game plan against aggressive combination decks. Actually, I think they're in general pretty bad against aggro decks too, like mono red decks. They tend to be a little better against like White Weenie or like Death and Taxes style decks. Decks that hate out mana base is very tough for them, like Blue Moon. But Blue Moon also plays a lot of permission. So basically, permission I think is a big one for them, like efficient permission. And aggressive combination decks, I think, are really tough for a more value-oriented 5-color control deck. It looks like 4-color control, if they're not playing red, 4-color control deck to beat up on, especially considering they're very value-oriented. It does not look like they have a lot of permission to kind of back up their value their value build on all walkers. Anyways, guys, quick pause. We'll be back for the next game. I'm sorry, this match, I can only get this one game because the first game is bugged all the heck. I could not get it to run. Tried restarting Moto, but it did not end up running. But it kind of played out similarly to how this game played out. It was kind of a pretty straightforward matchup because I think we were just pretty heavily favored against our opponent's deck that's playing a lot more mana-intensive, color-intensive, and mana-intensive spells that just cost a lot more than the wide variety of answers that we have in our deck, which is going to be to your detriment. It's just mana advantage. Wouldn't even say per se card advantage. I mean, we eventually got to card advantage, but we're basically at mana parity. With them a little bit up because they're artifact mana, but yeah, it's just permission at the end of the day. We're just 1-for-1ing, but our 1-for-1s are cheaper than their big threats. So if we're only able to land one threat, which we don't only have two real threats or maybe four real threats in this deck, if we're able to land one, we just need to protect it and we can generally win. The other thing I'll note, like cards like Talisman of Progress, the Talismans, the Signets. Even to a certain extent, like Soul Ring and Mana Crypt, there's a cost to playing those cards. But the cost is, generally speaking, it's kind of like the ramp decks, right? Like the mono green ramp decks. You can run into draws where it's a big mana dead end draws, what I tend to call them. That comes at the cost of a card. So like progressing your mana with those cards does come at the cost of a card that you no longer have that produces business. Now I'm not saying they're bad. That's not at all what I'm saying, but I'm just saying they do have a cost associated with them that I think a lot of folks tend to not see. And also, drawing Dimir Signet like turn 30 in a game is just not good. Like, you're just like, oh goodness. Drawing at turn 2 is great. Or playing it out on turn 2 is pretty strong generally, especially when you have a lot of 4 and 5 drops in your deck. But you draw it late, it's not so hot. It's pretty cold draw. That's kind of one of the costs associated with it as well. I kind of like look at these cards and kind of actually in a way, and it sounds kind of odd, but I tend to consider like the Signets and the Talismans actually card disadvantage. They're just mana because it's a card that doesn't do business, but it enables business. So I'm not saying they're bad, but I'm saying in general they're a sunk resource. Like they're a sunk cost. They're kind of like playing a land that costs mana, or a ramp spell. They're like a ramp spell basically. And whenever you're playing against decks that ramp, having permissions generally tend to benefit you because it just means you have more cards that provide more answers in your hand than they have threats. Because they're having to play these cards. Anyways, quick assessment on this matchup. I don't think it's a great matchup for our opponent. Probably not the best of games, but I do think there's some interesting takeaways from it as well. Really frankly from both games, because both games were kind of against decks that had elements of ramp in them. And when you have elements of ramp in your deck, and I'm not saying it's bad to have ramp is very strong. But when you have elements of that, you have to assume that in general you're going to have lower density of relevant cards. What I mean by that is if they're using a card to ramp, and I have 2 counter spells in hand, I don't have to counter the ramp. I can counter the one less card they have in hand that's important to them to actually win. So that's kind of how I think you have to look at the matchup. And I think it's kind of just interesting to see it in 2 vastly different decks against a green ramp deck, and then against like an all planeswalker artifact ramp deck. All right, guys, be back momentarily for the next game in this match sets. Alrighty, guys, we're back. This hand's fine. I mean, it's got a little land heavy, but that's not a bad thing for this deck. We're running 39, so we have to assume that's going to happen some of the time. Against an aggressive deck, this hand's actually pretty strong. It's better than it looks. Preordained is going to probably help find its permission, is what our thinking is. We want to find permission with it. More than likely, if we're against like a mid-range or aggressive deck, we'll cast out Timely on turn 3 after ostensibly or ideally countering something on turn 2 with our mana, and then transition into a Fact or Fiction on turn 4 and try to, either counter some more stuff, bide some more time, draw some more cards, or find a win condition. So hand's fine. Alright, we see a Temple of Malady. That could either be Blue Moon, it could be Grixis, we don't know yet. But in general, I see that land, and I'm thinking that Timely Reinforcements is probably not that good. We know our opponent now is likely on Grixis. Find another island here. I just play it out. And I'm planning on impulsing here. We have a Fall cast against us. I actually brainstorm in response to Fall because I kind of want to tuck some cards that I don't want to discard. And I also want to see if I can find lands to increase the land count in my hand so that Fall has less of a probability of hitting. If you're not familiar with Fall, let me pause it for a second and pull it up, because Fall is kind of more of a techie card, but it's a card I've played historically too. It's kind of like it's a redundant Hymn to Turek with additional utility that is singularly worse than Hymn to Turek, but a lot easier to cast. So this card reads, the fall half of Rise Fall reads, target player reveals 2 cards at random from their hand, then discards each non-land card revealed this way. So what ended up happening is they actually got my Timely Reinforcements, which I'm not upset about. That was kind of the worst card in my hand once I saw I was playing against Grixis. Another card they saw was probably a basic of some sort. Let's see, an island, which ended up playing out. The Rise half says return target creature from a graveyard and target creature on the battlefield to their owner's hands. That's obviously pretty powerful. It's a big, powerful tempo swing. So this card is great. Like I do think this card's underplayed in Grixis. I don't see it played as often as I think it should be. But oftentimes the fall half of Rise Fall you want to tend to use in the mid to late game because in the early portions of the game, like my hand could be very landed, especially because I'm control. So they didn't get a ton of value out of it. They got one card. It was basically a card for a card there. And I was able to hide my Mystical Tutor on top. So, anyways, we draw back into Impulse and Mystical Tutor. Those are the cards I kept. Now, I play this game pretty passively, and I think I probably play it more passively than I should have. And I think this first game, spoiler, I'm going to lose it. And then I'm going to, this first game in this match, I'm going to lose. I end up finding Ancestral here. I could have tried casting the Fact or Fiction in response, but I kind of wanted to get Mystical Tutor off to get vast card advantage. I'm trying to play around Counter Magic, but honestly, I think I probably played this too passively and should have just aggressively fired off the Fact or Fiction there. They go for a Collective Brutality here. I know I'm going to lose the Ancestral Recall, so I act like I'm going to try to go find a counter spell. I don't. So this is another play I don't like. I don't like that I cycle the Hieroglyphic Illumination here. The reason I did it is because I didn't want to give them options. I figured at that point they were going to have to take Ponder, unless I hit specifically like something like Mystic Confluence, which they would probably certainly take. But I think I probably should have forced them to make the choice there. And if I kept Hieroglyphic Illumination, drawing 2 cards is a lot better than 1. But I did end up cycling it there, and I'm not sure if I like that play. I'm not even sure if Hieroglyphic Illumination is better than Ponder. I'm not sure if drawing 2 is more powerful than Ponder's effect. That's probably a bold statement to make, but it's more cards obviously, but it's a lot less selection. And as you can see, we have a fetch land in hand now, which is powerful. So Desolate Lighthouse is a rough one for me. I'm going to try to cause a fight on their EOT. I'm going to let them Desolate Lighthouse here, but when I see Elspeth Sun's Champion, I'd opt to try to cause a fight. I do go ahead and just draw a bazillion here. I don't really hit that well. One of the things you'll find in this game, and I think it does kind of tie back to my Hieroglyphic Illumination decision, and my decision possibly with Mystical Tutor, is that I hit a lot of lands here. Now, I get unfortunate with this Hymn to Turek. I have a bunch of land in hand, but they probably hit the 2 most relevant cards in my hand. Well, they hit one of the most relevant cards, which is Fractured Identity, which is basically their best threat they can play becomes my best threat, or my threat at that point. I do play out Gideon because I have no counter magic. Like, I'm just kind of, out of gas. I don't have permission, which is kind of odd for this deck. I have hit very little permission this draw. Actually, I've only hit 2 permission spells in this draw. And this is about like a 24 permission count deck. And my permission I've hit has been Mystic Confluence and Mental Misstep. And if you've heard me speak on Mystic Confluence, I think it's kind of an awkward card in Control Mirrors in general. It's very powerful, but it's just kind of awkward because of the cost. At this point in the game, it's fine to be able to cast it, but it's just generally you don't want it to be the only counter spell you have. Thing in the Ice gets cast here. I'm like, okay, that's not good, because Thing in the Ice can definitely beat Elspeth pretty easily. I find to Settle the Wreckage, though, which is pretty nice here. I just go ahead and attack. I figure I need to start chipping away at them, because they're going to be chipping away at Ice on Thing. And eventually when that flips, I'm going to be kind of in, I'm going to have some issues, because it's going to pressure my Elspeth. Even if I'm able to deal with the flipped Thing in the Ice, the Woken Horror, effectively, it's still going to erase all of my 1/1s that I've built up. They have a pretty cool techie play with Remand here. They remand their own Ponder and are able to cast. They're able to cast Ponder again. Now I'm out of permission. I think it was correct to try to Mental Misstep Ponder, but it seemed pretty apparent because they'd seen that I had Mental Misstep in hand. That they had the ability to protect it in some way, shape, or form. They cast Subterranean Tremors for I believe 0 here, just leaving a bunch of mana untapped. Erase all of my 1/1 tokens, and I'm going to attempt to cast Settle here. Unfortunately, we get pretty bad news, and Loot House has done a little bit of work for them. And we get counterfluxed, which is rough. So Elspeth goes the way of the bin. Losing out on the Fractured Identity and the cast out, pretty good here, right? Because we're kind of in a position where we definitely don't want to be. So some very good, effective discard from our opposition. And followed up by significant pressure, which I think is really important. Like, you definitely want to get pressure on as well. And by the end of this, you kind of see like our draw has been a little bit awkward. We definitely, based on probabilities, we hit 2 more lands than we should have on how many cards we're at. Which, is something that can happen with this deck. It's a risk that this deck assumes. Because it's running 39 lands, as the game goes long, especially if you have like a more attritional fight like this, you could just you can very easily flood if you end up in a position where you have no cards in hand. So definitely did not go according to game plan. Even though we were able to cast an Ancestral Recall in this game, some good point discards, some good aggro control threats, were able to really lock us up. And the card I think that did the most work against us in this entire game was actually Desolate Lighthouse. I think this card probably did significantly more than we know without talking to our opponent about what they were able to loot away. One of the issues you run to in aggro control is like not everything is good all the time. So like a card like Subterranean Tremors is actually horrific against my deck. Dreadbore, very medium. We do have a Walker, but I mean it's in general going to be just kind of stuck in someone's hand. The card consistency of the Grixis decks tends to be a little more flexible, right? But there are some cards that are generally running Grixis that are not going to be very good against a near creatureless deck. Which kind of gives us some equity, I think, in card relevance because we're just running more Permission. And Permission in general is going to always be relevant as long as your opponent's casting spells. Now, if they're like Landless Dredge and Hunter card, which I've never seen, then Permission is just god-awful. But that's not a possible thing. So, in general, folks are casting spells. And Permission tends to just always be kind of relevant. Card draw tends to just, always build relevant options. That's kind of the theory behind the deck. And why I think in general it should be decently favored against a deck like Grixis. But here, we kind of get our lunch money taken. We get beat up by Awoken Horror / Thing in the Ice. It's a very effective point discard used by our opponent. Was able to kind of knock some of the relevant stuff out of our hand, and by the time they needed to get to a position of dominance with their cards, But as you can see, we're very landed. We're at 2 cards above our opponent. I believe they have 10 lands in play to our 15. Now we're probably playing 2 more lands than they are playing. Because we're at a 39 land deck. Most Grixis builds are 37. I think 37 is probably where their list is at. 37 to maybe 38, but probably 37. So we are bound to draw more. But, as you can see, like we probably drew 2 to 3 more lands than we wanted to this game, and the point discard kind of just packed us away. But I do think it's worth highlighting because that is a weakness of running as many lands as this deck's running. When you have a decent or sizable clock on board, your opponent does on board, and significant disruption to the hand zone, then you can get to positions like this where you're kind of hell-bent and just hoping to mise, and frankly, the deck does not mise that well against onboard threats. It's going to generally tend to, its highest percentile draws are going to be lands or it's going to be counterspells. Sometimes cantrips or card selection, which is going to be better in this position, but oftentimes it's going to be Permission or it's going to be lands, and Permission's not good against onboard advantage, obviously. So, not a position you want to get yourself into. Alright guys, we'll be back for Game 2 here momentarily. Alright guys, we're back. So we know we're facing Grixis. This hand is pretty good. It's got an Impulse to find whatever we may need. It's got a Counterspell. It's got Attention Sphere for an early Walker. It's got a JVP, which I'm going to play out. Like, I think JVP has a high chance of getting killed. But the chances that they kept a hand that has low creature removal is pretty high because creature removal is kind of like an auto mulligan for them. So I think if they had a high creature kill, like they had like a bunch of Go for the Throats and Dreadbores, I think they probably would consider going to 6 because it's already kind of a mull to 6 if you have that. This deck only runs 2 critters. So I do get rid of Mystic Confluence here. Again, like I said, I think that card is very powerful. However, I don't think it's, 1, it's not good in this phase of the game, and 2, it's very inefficient. I already have a 5 that I want to play in the form of Teferi. So that's why I pitch it to the Jace here and look just to have good mana development. I pick up Censor here because I'm already pretty much assured my next land drop. I ditch the Plains. Biskelk, so I like how my opponent played this. They played this very strong. I like how they Coal against command on my upkeep. Very, very good play. Forces me to use my mana on my turn. I go ahead and get rid of the Censor. Punished. If I'd been able to protect my Jace on their turn, I think it would have been, a lot better for me. Now, I put in an unenviable position here of, I think, I can't counterspell plus Detention Sphere the Nicol Bolas, so I kind of have to just pitch my Teferi out there. This also buys me another turn with Jace, which allows me to cast more spells on my yard. So my opponent can fire up their Creeping Tar Pit again here if they want, but it's still going to leave Jace on board, and I won't be able to get a card back with it. But my idea is here, I want to force them to fight over this Ancestral Vision, so they can't do that. So I can recast a Mystic Confluence and draw 3, basically get an Ancestral Recall of my own. So they do get this Vision off, and I'm down to 2 cards. They're up to 6, and we're at mana parity on board with me with a Jace Teleport Unbound. So I'm not looking very good right now. They cast on a Tasigur, which is fine. I rip into a Terminus, which is a fine draw. It allows me to get rid of the Tasker at a minimum. I go ahead and minus the Jace Telepath Unbound, just cast back Mystic Confluence to draw into a lot of cards. Find a fetch land, fetch. I don't need to find Swamp here because there's an Urborg in play with Altered Art. So I do have my black fix already if I do end up finding the Mystical Teachings. They go ahead and activate finally and get rid of the Jace Telepath Unbound. Jace Telepath Unbound did his job, though. He was able to do some early card filtration and then provide us, I think like almost a 5-for-1 because we got to, 4-for-1. We got to draw a card off of Impulse for free, and we also got to draw 3 off of the Mystic Confluence. So Counterflux is unfortunately a card that they have in the repertoire. I do opt, bleed bottom and then top into a Timely Reinforce, which is a great target to discard to Nicol Bolas. I go ahead to Tension Sphere, the Nicol Bolas, so this card that I had in my opener is finally coming to be useful. And I'm down to 1 negate, so now I need to draw into some action, but I can probably answer, most of their, best threats, their Planeswalker threats. They go ahead and fire up their Creeping Tizzle, as I like to call it, and bang in there for 3. Can't do much about that. Manlands tend to be a problem for this deck. They cast out Kalitas, Trader of Get. That's kind of nerve-wracking. It's not really the best thing to see. I go ahead and keep the Hyrule Loom here because I want to get deeper in my deck. Cast it, draw into 2 cards. I don't want to play the top out because I kind of want to leave up Remand plus Negate to be able to get a little deeper in my deck before I get the top down. I'm not really under that much pressure yet. I mean, this is not a slow clock, but it's not an exceedingly fast clock either. So I'm still trying to look to build up options and value as the game goes along. Is kind of why I don't play top out here. I think top would be the play you make if you just need to do something now to win. Now, I put Entreat the Angels on top so I can do it on their EOT if I want to. But now that I know I have Entreat the Angels available to me after looking at my top deck, which includes Entreat, some irrelevant card, and then Mystical Teachings, I know that I can probably win this game at any point in time. I just go ahead and plow the Kalitas. Now, plowing Kalitas is kind of an interesting play there. I actually did that for a different reason you might think. I don't do it to manage the clock. I actually did it to see if I can get them to fight me, like to try to counter my spell. When they don't fight me and they play a Search for Azcanta, my thinking is their hand is probably actually doesn't have permission in it. So I opt just to go for it here. I'm like, all right, I'm just going to Entreat here and put them on a 2-turn clock. They've technically got me on a 3-turn clock. And because this is all happening instant speed, unless their last card's like a Lightning Bolt, then they can't really get me with this. And if they do get me with this, then I have top on top of my deck. I can replay the top, draw into the Mystical Teachings, which I know is the second card, lose my top, but find Swords or Path to Exile to deal with the Creeping Tar Pit. So I have this hand, obviously looking what we saw with our top was very good. But I do think we sequenced it correctly in leaving up Remand and Negate earlier to build up options with our top for later on. I don't think we're in that much of a rush. Now our opponent's at 7, so they're on a 1-turn clock, and they have us on a 2-turn clock. They're unable to flip Search for Azcanta, and evidently they do not have burn, so they go ahead and pack it in here, and we go into Game 3. This is kind of what the Miracles deck wants to do. And I think it's one of the areas that the Miracles deck just benefited in is that, it has less situationally good cards, but it also has less threats, which is kind of a risk associated, but it has a ton of counter magic, and in general, if the game goes long like this, we're going to be able to kind of just, get down an insurmountable threat like 16 power and just go to town with it. Unfortunately due to the line we took, we couldn't use Swords to Plow. We used Swords to Plowshares. We couldn't do it for a lethal swing, and even if we had tried to do that, they were at 24. They would have been at 27 off the Kalitas attack. Another line could have been you flip top and then make an additional angel and block Kalitas. That's an option. And it may have been, if we assume they had nothing in hand, then that would have been more correct. The problem was I just didn't assume they had nothing in hand. But when I plowed their thing and it didn't get countered, and then they played a Search for Azcanta out and they were down to 1 card, I was like, all right, I'm pretty sure you don't have counter magic. That's why we ended up taking that line. So the line kind of looked weird, but it was more about generating options and determining hidden information than it was about, just the most streamlined, just, get as many angels as I can on the board kind of play, the cowboy magic play, if you will. So that's kind of why we did that line. I was just trying to determine what was going on. It was more of a fact-finding mission, is why we Swords to Plowshares there. Could have been also more correct to get the Creeping Tar Pit, but I don't know about that. I think Creeping Tar Pit's it's slow enough, and it costs so much mana. The big sell is that Creeping Tar Pit costs 4 mana to hit me with it. And these decks are going to try to be fighting on mana advantage, and I think, I want to maintain as much mana advantage as I can over them. And Creeping Tar Pit, just because it requires so much to input into it, oftentimes you can just kind of get them with that. If they have multiple counters, they can't cast all of them or whatever, or they can't produce more pressure. Yada yada yada. Anyways, guys, quick pause. We'll go into Game 3 in this match set against Grixis. I'll call it Grixis Control, but probably Grixis more like aggro control. I tend to call most decks that folks call control aggro control because they play a lot of creatures. Whereas I'll call like the deck that I'm playing control because it runs 2 creatures that are pretty much spells. They're both control decks, but I would say theirs is more on the mid-range spectrum, aggro control spectrum. It's going to play an aggro control game against my deck, I think, in general. Anyways, guys, quick pause. We'll be back for the next game. Alright, guys, we are back. Yeah, this hand's fine. It's got a top, so if I don't get turn 1 discarded, it's great. I kind of want top. I draw into the best card in my deck, Ancestral Recall, and I opt to leave up both Spell Pierce and Recall here. They cast on a JVP. Now, I make an odd play here. I think I actually played this incorrectly. I probably should have just Caracas this thing. I don't. I actually Path to Exile it. I think I misplayed this. I think I definitely should have just Caracased it. They cast a Mana Leak. I kind of wanted to cause a fight, is I think what I was thinking. I wanted to get resources out of their hand, and I didn't think they could really take that much advantage of mana. They do have the man land again, which is annoying. I kind of get punished by this line because I would have much rather had the Path to Exile to deal with a man land than I would something like Jace Vryn's Prodigy. But from what we saw in the last couple games, Caracas is going to be doing a little bit of overtime because they have a lot of legendary threats. I put Memory Lapse on top, but I am kind of looking for lands at this point with Sensei's Dividing Top because after this turn I'm going to be kind of hard up to make my land drops. I'm not going to slam Jace out there. I'm going to end up leaving up Mystical Teachings and Cast Out and Memory Lapse. They do cast Adventure on EOT. I do go ahead and Memory Lapse that so they're forced to redraw it. But I know now that it's in hand. They go ahead and, I believe, slam a Treasure Cruise here, which, is not great for me. Not the best. I fetch first because I don't really want the other 2 cards on the top of my deck. I really want to find mana at this point. I find Mystic Gate, which is what I'm going to keep, and there is a Terminus and a Personal Tutor on top. So what I end up doing is playing up my Jace here to get some onboard advantage, or to get some advantage over both the decks. They have, I believe, an Inquisition of Kozilek on top of their deck. So I plus him because I don't want it to get burned out. I also don't want it to get attacked to death by 1 attack from Creeping Tar Pit. I go ahead and put Terminus in hand at this point in time. They cast out the Venser. I'm going to allow Jace to get bounced here. I mean, I could try to fight it with Mystical Teachings, but I kind of want to use Mystical Teachings to accrue more advantage. I'm probably going to use it to find Snapcaster Mage just to get up on cards. So they have Treasure Cruise to this point, so my assumption is their hand is pretty stacked. I do cast Teachings here, find the Snapcaster Mage, which shuffles my deck again. The reason that I put Terminus in hand is because I plan on doing this line, so I did not keep the Personal Tutor, which could have found Terminus again. I just kept the Terminus because it actually keeps me at card parity as opposed to going down a card by using the Personal Tutor. And since I figured my Jace would get bounced, I figured that I'd have the ability to put Jace back, or put the Terminus back on top of my deck. So the Inquisition, they only have 1 target in my hand, which is Snapcaster Mage, so I'm going to play it out here. I found that I have a Force of Will on top post-shuffle effect. So they find nothing with the Inquisition of Kozilek, attempt to cast Nicol Bolas. I end up casting Ancestral Recall, which they don't do anything about. I do go ahead and top here. The reason that I top here is that I actually want to look for a better blue card to pitch to Force of Will than Jace the Mind Sculptor. I get pretty punished here, and they have Spell Pierce, which stinks. But, I would rather have Jace than, I think, Factor Fiction in this matchup. I do go ahead and get rid of the Terminus here. I have a Caracas and a bunch of Legends, and I also have a Gideon that I think is a more proactive Wrath effect. And I also have Cast Out, so I go ahead and cast Out and cast Jace the Mind Sculptor. I'm tapping on again, letting them basically know that I do not have permission. Bottom the island. Again, I want to put it to 5 because this is going to force them to cast a removal spell and also attack with all their stuff. So basically it commits their turn. It's basically a tap out for a tap out. I do find Celestial Colonnade, which is actually, it's funny because it's actually a really good card here. It's actually a great threat, so it's a good land card. If I had to draw land, that was the best one to draw probably. They fire up the Creeping Tar Pit. I believe attack the Gideon down to 1. I'll go ahead and look with top. I find a Snare, a Pierce, and a Fetch land. Go ahead and draw into the spell Snare. Fire up the Gideon and just attack. I want to put them at a low enough life total that I can actually clock them with Celestial Colonnade. The plan here is to get a shuffle effect off of Castback on Mystical Teachings. Again, Urborg's in play. So I do go ahead and cast out the Mystical Teachings here. Find Swords to Plowshares. Wait for them to turn it. I should have waited for them to turn it sideways before I did this, but I'm actually really low on clock, so I'm playing rapidly here. They unfortunately, I believe, have a Logic Knot here, which I cannot spell Snare. So I go ahead and look with top. I find Teferi. My Gideon is going to die, so this gets countered. Cool. Gideon is dead. I look again because I think I misstacked it when I was hurriedly clicking through to not time out. I do go ahead and get down the Gideon, or I'm sorry, the Teferi. Draw here into Brainstorm. Find 2 lands and a fetch land. Fetch immediately because I don't want to draw either of those lands, and I want to get another look with top on their turn. So go ahead and pass it back to them. I go ahead and untap my Myriad Landscape so that I have an additional shuffle effect after looking with top if I don't find anything relevant that I need. They actually don't attack this turn. I guess they assume that I have something. I don't know. Or maybe they just missed it because they're also low on clock. It's hard telling. So I just go ahead and fetch here. Actually, I don't know why I did that. I was playing fast. I shouldn't have fetched there. I should have fetched after looking with top. I go ahead and find Nile Spellbomb because it allows me to draw into a counter spell, Cryptic Command, namely. Play out the Nile Spellbomb. It also allows me to protect it from discard. But I go ahead and draw here regardless with Teferi. Which was possibly wrong. They end up casting a Torrential Gearhulk. I do go ahead and just Cryptic Command this. Just get it. They could have been trying to get value off of Dismember, and instead they just opted to play it out to threaten my Teferi. They go ahead and try to cast a Snapcaster here. I just Spell Pierce it. Now I'm kind of at Bupkis in hand. I have 2 lands, but I do have a top in play, which, I don't know what's on my top deck yet. I probably end up looking in response to the activation. I find Settle the Wreckage, which is a pretty good card. They go ahead and swing in there towards my Teferi. I go ahead and draw into Settle. I have 2 lands beyond it, which is not great. And because we're playing fast, we kind of did punt on the use of our Myriad Landscape because we actually had additional shuffle effect we could have exploited. They play out Kalitas. I go ahead and get rid of Kalitas. Plus, look, bottom, both those cards. Plan on firing up a Dig Through Time probably on their turn. They're down to 2 cards. Likely one of them is not permission. But I don't really mind if they counter Dig Through Time because I'm actually in an advantageous board position right now with both Teferi and Celestial Colonnade to pressure them, and they have no threat. They play a land out here. I believe attempt to cast out a Tasigur. They do cast Tasigur successfully. I'm not looking to fight that because I'm at 1 minute and 15 seconds. I could have used top or Dig Through Time to actually find something, but I'm just going to Karakas it back to hands because it's less time intensive to use Karakas on Moto. So they get a Snapcaster back. I just let them have it after bouncing their Tasigur. So they basically spent their whole turn to get a Snapcaster. To basically spent a bazillion mana to draw a Snapcaster, which I'm fine with because I'm winning on board right now. I go ahead and PT for Entreat the Angels so that I can draw into it on their EOT. Basically force them to have a counter, and they go ahead and pack it in here. So very time-intensive match against Grixis Control with I'm going to call it Azorius Miracles. I'll continue to call it different things. Like sometimes I'll call it Esper, but it's not really an Esper deck. It's really an Azorius deck that splashes black. But very, very cool game against Grixis. I had a lot of fun playing it. And obviously my clock shows that it was a very thought-intensive game as well. Even though I do think we misplayed a couple things, especially in this last game because we were playing quickly. So hopefully you don't fault me too much. I was just trying to take the fastest lines to get there because I figured if I played the perfect lines, I probably would have run out of time in this game. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'm going to be back momentarily for another match, and then I think we're going to go ahead and call it a wrap. Alrighty, guys, we are back, and this is a great hand. It does a little bit of everything. It's got creature removal, it's got counter magic, it's got card advantage in the form of Mystic Confluence. It just doesn't have a threat. But this deck's not going to often keep hands that have threats because it has so few. We get him to Turret. That's rough. It hits 2 very good cards, but honestly, at a minimum, it didn't hit my lands. It didn't hit all of my lands. I wouldn't have minded it hitting 1 land, but what can you do? We get Inquisition. We're going to lose our Path to Exile, so we're down to 1 actual card in hand. The rest are all lands. We draw into a land, because that's what this deck does. It draws a lot of lands. Opponent plays Cabal Therapy, so they're going to get our last card. So we've gotten discarded 3 times, well, 4 times, if you count him as 2. I get to Portent here. Portent's actually really powerful in this matchup, because I'm able to put the least relevant card in my hand, and keep the most relevant card for my draw next turn. So I have Mystical Teachings on top of my deck, so I get Mind Twisted here. So I've discarded a bazillion cards this game. But I do have Mystical Teachings now, which means I'm going to find Ancestral Recall with it, and draw cards so I can play a game of Magic. Opponent ends up playing out Sidisi Undead Vizier. They sack it immediately to Tutor. I'm assuming they want to find probably like a Planeswalker or something like that, so they can actually put pressure on, have a value engine that also puts pressure on me. Mystical Teachings for Ancestral here on EOT. Go ahead and Ancestral, targeting myself, obviously. I actually tap to draw here. I really want to find an untapped land. I don't find an untapped land. It's kind of crazy. I just don't find an untapped land there. I only found 1 land, and it was the irrigated farmland. So it was a riskier, more greedy line to do that, but I think it was correct. I think you wanted to find your land drop there to get up on cards, or to get up on mana advantage. So I'm kind of forced to actually get rid of the Karn here with Cast Out. They're down to 3 cards. I'm kind of making the assumption that they don't have enough business they don't have more business, but they have 5 Cabal there, or Cabal Coffers, and play on not a Negator, an Obliterator, a Phyrexian Obliterator. This card's sweet. Obliterator's not a card you block, so I'm not going to play out Timely there. But I also don't mind taking a beating. I can take a beating for a little while. My guess is that they're kind of like somewhere between a control deck and a mid-range deck and a ramp deck. Which means that I think their draw relevance in any given matchup is going to be, in general, a little more variable than my own. I get lucky here. When I remand this, I draw into a Terminus. I go ahead and Terminus. It's one of the things the deck can do, and you've seen it happen quite a bit. It actually happens more than you'd think, even without setting it up. And oftentimes you set it up so you can do it at instant speed. Find Snapcaster, which is another recall. So from having a Hymn to Turek, Inquisition of Kozilek, Cabal Therapy, which hit, Mind Twist resolved against us in the first 4 turns of the game, we're actually up by 7 cards right now that we've seen. Now, we haven't played all of them, but we've definitely seen 7 more cards. And that's what I kind of mean. It's like they're going to have cards like Go for the Throat, where it's just not a relevant card against me. I don't really care if Snapcaster dies here. It was cast solely as a means of recasting Ancestral Recall. They're going to probably Field of Ruin my Soul Devi Excavation, but I don't really mind them using that resource, and it also thins my deck a bit. I'm going to leave up Mystical Teachings here. And, ostensibly, quote-unquote, a bunch of permission. I think they have to, safely assume that I have a lot of permission in hand. I don't. I have a couple of situational counters. But I do have the ability to recast Mystical Teachings to find permission if I really need to on their turn. In response, I go ahead and find Dig Through Time with it. So basically, I used it for I used Mystical Teachings in this game, the front side and back side, both for card advantage options. I find a counterspell plus Teferi, Hero of Dominaria. So I'm going to get down the Teferi this turn. I'm going to have the untap on the end step, which is going to leave me with 2 islands open, which plays around Wasteland and allows me to leave up Logic Knot for approximately a bazillion. They can make approximately a bazillion mana, but I think I can make a bazillion plus 1 mana with my graveyard. I just start chump blocking the silly Grey Merchant. They have a Malicious Affliction. I tap like I'm going to counter this. It's kind of just a techie play. I'm just trying to get them to think that I have a counter, so they don't play something good with their last card if they have it, but they're probably going to play out their last card if it's a good card. I find Elspeth here. Elspeth's probably the end. I don't know if I'd say the beginning of the end, but probably the end of the end for them. I think it's going to be pretty tough for them to beat around in Elspeth. I tap 2 non-basics so I can represent white mana on their turn. I don't know how relevant that is. My hand's actually not that great. Blatant Tendrils is fine. It's going to shrink their Grey Merchant beyond being able to damage my Planeswalkers, and even if they could, I wouldn't really care that much. Gristlebrand is a problem card, though. I'm going to counter Gristlebrand. By the way, I love that altered DCI Judge promo Gristlebrand art. I think that card looks sick. The original art's sick too, but Gristlebrand is a sweet card, and there's not a lot of decks in this format that actually hardcast them. As it for some reason goes, like they say Siege Rhinos run in packs, I'm pretty sure Elspeth and Entreat the Angels run in packs in my deck, because I was on a roll during this series of games, just drawing Elspeth into Entreat the Angels. Anyways, very interesting game, and I think it's one of the things I want to showcase is that having further possibilities or probabilities of draw are actually better than having denial of probabilities. I think in Canadian Highlander. Now that needs to be tempered with the fact that denial of probabilities, disruption, is very strong when you couple it with threats or with pressure. In this case, we lost every single card in our hand. Outside of knowing our top deck perfectly through the Portent, which was set up as Mystical Teachings, in the first 4 turns. So we had nothing left. We had 4 lands and nothing against all of the discard. But we had no pressure on us. So we were able to kind of get back into this game with Mystical Teachings, twofold, finding Ancestral Recall and then also finding Dig Through Time. We had Interim Snapcaster. So at the end of this game, despite having our entire hand completely demolished by turn 4, we're up 17 cards. That's kind of the power of this deck. And I'll say it. That's what Xerox does. That's what it's intended to do. Is just get after as many, be capable of seeing as many cards as possible. Because even in the mid game, after we'd had a bunch of cards discarded and our hand was demolished, we had actually seen more cards than our opponent had, which is kind of the power of it. Is it gives you a lot of decision making, and that is power. Anyways, guys, quick pause. We'll be back for game number 2 in this match set. Alrighty, guys, we are back. This hand's acceptable. It doesn't have white mana, but, it should be able to get after some. Expedition map's a little spooky. Yeah, find a plains. Why not? Be a luck sack. They ritual here, which is kind of spooky because I'm not going to be able to counter their first play. I was kind of hoping that I'd have time to get the mana leak down, but I did not, unfortunately. That's obviously one of the big differences between being on the play and being on the draw. I do give them the Night's Whisper, I believe, over a discard spell. Threat. I possibly should have just given him a threat. What I'm looking to do is bide time here. I do play out Search for Iscanta, basically showing my hand that I don't have counter magic. I'm looking to get to 4 and 5 mana because I want to cast out and I want to cast Fractured Identity to steal something. They play a Phyrexian Arena, so basically they have pressure and they have card draw engines on board. What I have to do here is play Jace the Mind Sculptor because I figure it's a threat. It's a card engine they have to answer. I could have cast out to keep them off cards, but I think I also want to get my own card engine down here. They cast on a Pack Rat, which is probably one of the worst things they could have played because it's kind of a threat that just keeps on giving. I go ahead and draw here, see a bunch of lands. I shouldn't have played my land first, but, I did. Screwed up. Should have actually kept a fetch, or the option available to find a fetch land off the top. I go ahead and Fractured Identity the Karn. I plus it. I make this line of play because I made a mistake, and the reason I make that line of play is because I want to get rid of the 2 lands that I know I have on top of my deck. So the next turn I can draw into a fresh card, because my Jace is going to die here. It's going to get attacked by the Construct token. Find an island. Find Personal Tutor, which is pretty powerful. It means I can Terminus the board. Unfortunately, it also puts me a turn back on being able to cast... correction, does not. So I play Teferi. I cast Personal Tutor to find Terminus. I'm going to untap the Plains and the Tundra with Terminus on top of my deck. I'm going to cycle the cast out, cast the Terminus, and the plan here is to use Teferi to tuck the Phyrexian Arena on the following turn so that I can counter on the backswing. Now, it's predicated upon them not being able to present pressure on this turn, which is not very likely. They unfortunately cast Josuves and have a bazillion power on board. I ditch the island. I draw here. I figure I have to draw because I need to make a land drop, because what needs to happen here is I need to do this. I need to find a Wrath effect, and I need to Wrath the board, unfortunately. I go ahead and ponder, knowing that I probably don't have any options in my deck, and I don't. I don't find an option in my deck that doesn't exist in my deck, so I die. I die to Josuves. I do think we played this game decently well. I do think the land drop pre-Jace the Mind Sculptor was loose. I think we should have waited on a fetch land for that. And actually, maybe if we'd done that... Actually, no, I know if we'd done that, the game... The probabilities in the game would have changed, right? Because we would have been able to get rid of the land cards that we did not want. And then if we had stolen Karn on the following turn or if we'd stolen Karn on that turn to look at our top 2 cards, we would have seen something different. Possibly 2 action cards, maybe. That said, that misplay may have... It cost us some match percent points, I think. Not probably a ton, but it was a misplay in general. But yep, play to our ounce here. Unfortunately they had the pressure. We weren't able to buy the time to get rid of the Phyrexian Arena. If we had and they did not have pressure on board, I think we're very advantaged. But unfortunately, that's not how the game played out, and we kind of got into a position here where we're just kind of boxed into to the status of death. All right, guys, quick pause. We'll be back momentarily for the concluding game in this match. Alrighty, guys, back. This hand's great. You get to see what the new includes, which is Glacial Fortress. Opponent, unfortunately, mulligans down to 4. I assume that's probably one of the more of the risks of like a non-Xerox style or non-cantrip heavy deck, is that you oftentimes are going to have more mulligan decisions. They have a pretty good start, though. They have a Soul Ring. Also, if they're going to draw swamps, Lake of the Dead's very powerful. They can cast a lot of things with that. So, despite all of that, they have a lot of mana. I draw one of the worst cards in my deck at this point in the game, which is the Entreat the Angels. I do just Council's Judgment, the Soul Ring, and I'm kind of hoping they don't have, like, relevant card plus Swamp in hand. They don't have a Swamp in hand. They have a Bazooka Bog, which gets rid of my graveyard, which is kind of annoying because it means that now, I don't have as much delve count for my dig through time. So, my cards are pretty expensive in hand outside of Condescend. They go ahead and attempt to cast a Vizier, Sidisi Undead Vizier here. I am going to get Condescend value here. I do go ahead and Condescend this card. If you look at my top deck, I'm pretty happy with the land. I think I bottomed the Fractured Identity. The reason I bottomed Fractured Identity is because I already have threats in hand. I don't really need another threat. I look at Fractured Identity as not only just removal, but also just a threat. They do have Reanimate as another card. They actually do not exploit this Sidisi. My guess would be they just don't have enough resources to find anything else that would be relevant on the given mana resources they have. So they just want to put a 4-power attacker on the board and hope I can't deal with it, which I think makes good sense. I go ahead and dig through time here, finding Caracas, which can bounce that card, and a Mystic Confluence. What I have to do here, I debate, actually, I believe, using... Oh, I think Moto's going to misremember the game. Anyways, guys, this game's not all that interesting, so I'm not gonna try to replay it. I'm gonna pause the replay though. So what happens here is this: I don't do whatever the Moto game player thinks I did, or the recording thinks I did. What ends up happening is I play Caracas out. I end up using Elsbeth to make 3/1/1 tokens. On the following turn, they attack because I'm kind of forced into doing it. Maybe I, have a seizure and they get to kill my Elsbeth, but I end up blocking with a 1/1 token. On the following turn, I use the Caracas to bounce the Sidisi. They attempt to recast after trying to swamp the Sidisi. I missed a Confluence it, and they concede the game. Again, not the most interesting. This last game is kind of a letdown. But variance does play a role in Magic, and if you're playing a deck that is built, is lent more towards a higher variance game, which I think are going to be most decks that are not blue. I think blue in general just gives you more command over it. Then you assume some of that risk. You assume more of that risk, I think. But all decks, all Magic is a variance based game. But that said, them mulling to forward made it kind of I don't want to say a foregone conclusion. Like they could definitely be 4-card hands that just win games. But I think in general we're very heavily favored in that because they're just so low on resources. So we end up winning that way. Kind of an unfortunate way to conclude the matchup. I do think it was an interesting matchup, though, and that game one was very interesting because it kind of went to show, the seeming power of discard is the fact that it's powerful when it's backed up by the virtual advantage of a fast clock, i.e., you got no time to draw out of this, and you don't have any options in your hand. Like, that's good. When it's just that you don't have any options, well, again, Magic's a variance game. Like your top deck can provide, and if you're not under pressure, you have more time to have your top deck provide. And I think that was kind of interesting. But overall, this last game here is kind of a letdown. I'm sorry, Brams 3. That you hit a multi 4. Anyways, guys, I'm gonna go ahead and cut it there. I kind of wanted to just recover the deck real quick. Showcase the changes that we made during the deck tech portion of the last video that I did. The only change that I made after that video was the Glacial Fortress, which I think was correct. I think one planes can come out for a Glacial Fortress. I think it's more correct. Anyways, guys, hope you enjoyed it. I think this deck has pretty good game against most. I think you can play a pretty good game against most things with it. I do think it has less match neutrality than something like Jeskai. But I've been playing blue-white for a while. I am a big fan of the deck. I think it's just very fun to play. And you get to play some pretty cool games. Anyways, this is the deck. You got to see a wide variety of matchups. I've shown red deck wins, some mid-range matchups, some mid-range LD decks, some Reanimator. The only matchup we probably haven't showcased is the aggro combo matchups like Storm. But it's kind of hard to get a game of that online because not a lot of folks play it. So, anyways, I think you have a wide enough variety of Hoof in there. You have a lot of other control decks. So got to play a lot of different, kind of varied matchups and kind of showcase the deck's power. The deck is, recently I've just, I guess, been very lucky. The deck's just been hitting with a pipe for me. I think the last 10 or 12 games I've played with it, I've managed to take. Oftentimes it is a 2-1 in per match. It's a 2-1 deck. You generally tend to lose one to a little bit of variance. Most of the variance, including lands or mana. But it's possible that I need to relook the build and kind of just rethink it and maybe go down to 38 lands as opposed to 39. But that's something I need to look at in the future. I do think the deck's pretty close to where I want how I want it to operate. Where it's at right now. I think it's kind of there. There's obviously a lot of different builds of this deck. That's one of the powers I think of kind of like these blue decks is that they're very mutable, and I think we kind of got to showcase that a little more than we did in the first video in the brief theory crafting piece or deck building piece I did on sunk cost in deck building, with the Enlightened Tutor versus Dig Through Time being the last point in the deck selected. Anyways, guys, hope it was informative, and hope you guys enjoyed the gameplay and some of the theory crafting. Alright guys, enjoy, and take care now.